we're all going to be saying goodbye to accountants in 2 years. So the top dog at Microsoft has kind of come forward. He's done a press release and he said that accountants are basically going to lose the job in 2 years. Now, first of all, I think betting against accountants is not a way to get them to use your product. So I'm not really sure what his idea was here. What he should have said is probably that the role of accountant will have changed. Maybe it could be unrecognizable. I'm not sure. But I think things like judgment, client relationships, and as we've just said, trust and accountability, that can't be replaced. And I do think there will be business owners that will like a hands-off approach. I've got friends who will not make phone calls because they don't like to speak to people. You know, there's definitely this thought of like people just want instant access to an answer. They're not really bothered about the people side of things. But then there's also a lot of people that don't want to use AI. They don't trust AI. And I don't think we're going to be able to change that narrative in 2 years. In fact, would bet my house on the fact we will not be able to change the narrative in 2 years. I don't know. Have you two seen this infographic which is circulating, and it's like a grid and it says how like 0.3% of the population are using paid for AI tools? Have you seen that? Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen it, yeah.
And so like, how can we go from that to a full industry is going to be eradicated in that time frame?
Well, I actually did some Googling just to try and look at the adoption of, and I always talk about the adoption of e-commerce and its widespread adoption. Really is linked to the same time around the internet and the breakthrough that came in like 1995, but actually widespread adoption didn't happen until 2010. And if you look at cloud accounting, which we banged on about for however long in this industry, the breakthrough was around 2010, but widespread adoption still hadn't happened until the 2020s, like we were talking post-COVID. So maybe if you've got generative and AI, which again was around 2023, if we're looking at like cycles, I just think that there's a bit more of a longer lag than 2 years. I think that is ambitious, but there's things like, you said it, the trust and the liability, but there's also regulation and workflows. And I think there's just accountancy has all four of the things that would slow anybody down to having that widespread adoption across the board. I do think that that the profession will evolve though in that period. And I think that there's going to be, like we've said in the podcast for the last 2-3 years now, we were talking about having a real deficit of people coming in, juniors coming into the space. And there was a real problem with how we backfilled that. That was something prior to us talking about AI. We were constantly talking about how there was a talent deficit. And now I think that's probably okay, because that junior layer would have been under threat and probably will continue to be under threat in some way, because there's a load of tools that are doing those things that they would learn from. So the reconciliation, the variance analysis, the bookkeeping cleanup or data extraction, data cleanup, and in general. I think that we're looking at the evolution of the accountant's role into maybe something that says in 10 years' time, you have very, very small firms. And I do wonder what will happen to the bigger mid-tier firms, because I think you'll have advisors who are able to service hundreds of clients, one strategic advisor, hundreds of clients. And so I think in 2 years, the one thing that we're seeing from John's predictions and John logs is there's going to be major workflow automation, which is the first step. And that I think I can stand behind. But to what you said, there was not just the Mustafa Suleiman debate. I did see a separate piece that was posted by Stuart McLeod, which maybe you guys also caught, a 10,000 worder. And I don't think he's drinking from the Kool-Aid. I do think that there's some legitimate points in there about what will happen. But I do think that it's like the timeline is nowhere near what anyone's predicted. I did also see Dave Selleck's Vercel app, which is like the countdown to the end of accounting. So we are definitely going to circle back to that in 18 months' time. But
What a great use of AI that is.
exactly.
One thing I would say is though, if with this kind of redirections, you're saying like one person, they would be able to accommodate more clients and things. For that reason, what we're trying to tell accountants and bookkeepers is you need to be better at explaining your value to your clients and like why you are so great. And if anything, this just tells me that Mustafa Suleiman's accountant is really bad at portraying their value because he clearly thinks they don't do much.
They're probably
So
big four, Billy. That's what.
yeah, yeah. So he obviously doesn't appreciate what they do. So if you're listening, you need to tell Mustafa you do loads of work.
So like what a couple of things on this. I mean, I think the 2 year timeline is so difficult to figure out, right? And for all the reasons that India said, and obviously you talked about as well, Billy. But I do think, I mean, as much as I do appreciate Dave's kind of very, very cynical take on this, and particularly with his sort of his doomsday countdown clock that he's built, I do think we shouldn't be totally dismissive of this because, if you do look at particularly like the software industry, which has been massively disrupted as a consequence of like generative AI, where people now can build effectively their own technology with zero skill. I do think there is an element of that can come to our marketplace, and that is a significant risk. And I think the risk potentially isn't that an accounting firm will move quickly enough to disrupt the market, but actually someone else will come in. And we've talked about this before, so this isn't new. And so the challenge there is like what then happens? A little bit like we saw with challenger banks, maybe for example. We talk about some of those people in the market. You see how quickly people suddenly shift from the terrible experience of a high street bank to a much more seamless, customer focused experience. It isn't really giving you that many thrills. It's not really paying you lots of interest. It's not really giving you lots of opportunities to borrow money and stuff. But actually, just because it's built on an app, it's really simple to get in there. You can see exactly what you're doing. Your spending's categorized for you and stuff like that. I think that is kind of like maybe some of the experience that we'll start to see. Potentially that is where you'll see a tech business come into the marketplace and do it. And it is ripe for disruption because the only regulated parts of our world fundamentally are insolvency and audit. Everything else is up for grabs. And so there is the big challenge there. And the other thing I will just add quickly as well is like you talked about judgment, Billy, and I think this is really interesting because judgment comes from that kind of that accumulated knowledge and experience as a professional over a period of time, and yet we already know that any LLM that you use out there has more knowledge than you could possibly accumulate in a lifetime. What it perhaps doesn't always have is the right context to maybe to apply that to give the kind of correct professional judgment. But again, I guess over time, maybe if we see some small language models focused on the accounting sector or the audit sector or something, maybe we'll start to see that, and it'd be interesting to see how that interplays. But one little plug for me, I will just say that I did some research with ICAST last year, and that research is going to be released on the 17th of March. You'll be able to see what we did in terms of looking at how professional judgment might change when you start to use large language models in the profession.
Can I think as well, just on that note, that's why I've kind of stopped saying about large language models not being able to deal with complex tasks, because in 2 years, it will be unrecognizable in terms of the complexity that it can deal with. Because I don't think as humans, and especially humans that are not kind of working within AI, we cannot fathom the rate of kind of change and the rate of which these products are developing. So the judgment aspect, I 100% agree. Exactly, that's much more difficult to train than it is on kind of like the complex tax, for example, rules that they need to know about. So I think with complex tasks, that's why I didn't include it in my kind of things that it's not going to be able to do, because I think in 2 years' time it probably will do. So, Dave Selleck's countdown might be right in some respects, but in other respects, it might not be.